All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much again, all of you from Hack MIT, and we're really excited to host this webinar today for all of you. Today, we'll be talking about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence advancements and challenges can be relevant to the COVID-19 pandemic. Just for a brief introduction, I'm Layla Khan. I'm a freshman at MIT, and I'll also be the moderator for this panel today. And before we get started, I'm just going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves really quickly, talk about their background and how exactly they're involved in tech, or more specifically, artificial intelligence, and any insights they may have on this topic. So I'll begin in alphabetical order with the first panelist, John Cohn.
Oh, wow, I'm first. I'm John Cohn. I'm the IBM fellow at the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab. I've been at IBM for 39 years, and between my late father-in-law and my wife, I think I've been here 82 years as a family. I'm a giant MIT nerd, course 6, 1981, founder of Vomit, Vermont's own MIT club, and I'm very, very happy to be here. And my fourth year, I should say, it's our fourth year at Hack MIT.
Wonderful. I'm also on the Hack MIT team on corporate relations and logistics, so it'll be really great to get started in working with you over the next few years. Our next panelist is Stefan Mao. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Well, hi everybody. I'm Stefan Mao. I'm the founder and president of the East Coast Coalition for Tolerance and Non-Discrimination. It's a national nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting minority inclusion. We've launched 9 social justice initiatives with over 3,000 members from 15 universities in North America. And most recently, we're working on the Equitable Healthcare Access for Minorities project, which provides translated information about COVID-19 testing and treatment for over 120,000 vulnerable minorities with language or cultural barriers. We've been the recipient of the Clinton Foundation Student Action Fund and also the NYU Social Impact Grant. It's great to meet you guys today.
It's absolutely incredible. And our last panelist, and certainly not least, Integrity, would you like to introduce yourself?
Definitely. Thank you so much. I'm Integrity, GJC. I'm a medical doctor with an interest in public healthcare innovation. I'm the co-founder of Vaccine Global, which is a health tech startup focused on stemming the tide of counterfeit vaccination certificate through digital collaboration. Our solution is actually a finalist in the MIT Solve Challenge for 2020. Also, I've been working with William and Mary Global Research Institute on the project of using AI and metadata to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in Zimbabwe. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
And it is a pleasure of mine to be your moderator. Thank you all so much for the introductions. So as you can see, our panelists range from having technical backgrounds to even having backgrounds in terms of medicine and in terms of equity. And all of these topics are going to be very relevant when it comes to the discussion of artificial intelligence and COVID, especially due to the multifaceted nature of the issue itself. And so one of the greatest considerations is equity and accessibility in COVID-19 technology. And a lot of people have questions about this. And so I'm actually going to pose the first question to Integrity. And the question is, since the start of the pandemic, artificial intelligence technology has been used to diagnose, treat, and monitor COVID-19. But it also has been used and shown to exacerbate historic healthcare inequalities. So given this context and your experience as a medical doctor and a public health consultant, can you expand on how incorrect or incomplete data can affect health systems and their ability to care for patients?
Thank you. I think that's a very relevant question given the context of the current situation that we are in. I mean, it's the risk of using incorrect, incomplete data has never been higher. I tell you what, I agree with the hypothesis that what COVID-19 has done is sort of like compress 5 years of technological evolution into 1 year. So all of the industries across board, including the health industry, have been forced to innovate. And, you know, in healthcare, traditionally, we are a bit resistant to innovation. But COVID-19 has put us in a situation where there is no option but to adopt technology. And you can imagine, in a country such as Zimbabwe, telemedicine was not even allowed, like the regulatory bodies do not even allow it. But because of COVID-19, it had to be allowed because our relatives were dying. So we had all this data that is now coming in, and the temptation to use that data, no matter how inaccurate or incomplete it is, the temptation is always there, and it is very high. Admittedly, there are other countries, of course, which made good use of their data, and they managed to manage COVID-19 well. But the challenge now is that because that data, like I said, because of just being forced to use this data that is incomplete and incorrect, that data cannot be translated across all populations and subgroups. And if you try to translate data from one subgroup and try to put it in another setting, it might be ineffective, and sometimes it might actually be dangerous. Take, for example, the issue of using biomarkers and certain behavioral tendencies to predict like the mortality of COVID-19. If you say we're going to use these behavioral tendencies to see who is most likely to die of COVID-19 so that we distribute the limited resources accordingly. If that data that you're using is wrong, it means that you are going to rob some people who actually need those resources of the resources that they need to die, and they're going to be distributing those resources to people who might actually not need them. So that is the greatest danger of using inaccurate or inadequate data, because you might actually rob people of the resources that they actually need. So it's a big challenge. In Zimbabwe, we've been trying to use AI and to try and map out like the next hotspots of COVID-19 using metadata, tracking the number of calls that are made, the movement of people, cellular data. So we realize that, in some areas, there are some people who actually don't have those mobile phones. So if we're going to formulate national policy using that data of people who only have cellular phones, it means there are some people who might actually need resources who are going to be robbed of the opportunity of getting those resources because they don't have phones anyway. So that is the greatest challenge with using inaccurate data, in that it might actually be dangerous, and it also exacerbates the health inequalities.
Most definitely. I think especially right now, the response needs to be science and data driven. And if there are any sort of limitations within our data sets, that overall can shift the efficacy of our own responses. And that can lead to extremely dangerous consequences, especially with the nature of health being a human issue that directly impacts human lives and how the implementation of our plan affects the COVID-19 response. And I guess a great follow-up question to this that I would have for all the panelists actually is, what steps could the scientific community be taking right now within artificial intelligence or in medicine to expand equity and ensure a more accessible COVID-19 response?
Well, one thing that I know, we're doing a project in collaboration with MIT and MIT Lincoln Labs in contact tracing. And what's interesting is it sounds like a perfectly, harmless kind of thing to be able to find out if someone has the disease and how they might be propagating it to others. One of the things you have to be very, very careful about if that data becomes misused, because the stigma associated with having been exposed, if that turns into a social problem, and there have been countries in the world that have used these kind of technology-enhanced contact tracing, but in a way that actually socially shames someone. Now, the problem with that is that might disincent someone to be honest. And the idea that if someone is, if you use that as a bias to be able to shame someone who's, really should be getting care and should be telling their story, then we actually have a real problem. So we've been spending a lot of time. Sorry for the train. This is real life. But the idea of how do you protect the identity of someone, yet still get the needed information about what his or her contact information might have been, and it's a very, very complicated kind of issue, because you want people to feel socially comfortable to be honest about their and you don't want them to be shunned or because they're ill. The last thing in the world you want them to be is socially disadvantaged. You want them to be incented to get care.
Most definitely. And I think inclusion definitely has its inherent challenges, because when you do input more data, I definitely can see how it potentially may alienate or disincentivize people to be honest because of that mere input. And I think that leads into a great segue about marginalized voices. I think what is extremely important about generally the issues in data limitations and how not accounting for all voices can really lead to some detrimental consequences. And so I actually wanted to turn to Stefan because of his work in equity and accessibility. And so you created the East Coast Coalition for Tolerance and Non-Discrimination last fall, before the COVID-19 pandemic was underway. So how do you think that the mission of ECC has changed in the past year, especially in light of COVID-19? And why has it been so important for you to ensure that marginalized voices remain represented throughout this pandemic?
No, thank you for the question. It's a great question. I did establish the East Coast Coalition back in 2019, before the COVID-19 pandemic. And the predecessor of ECC was actually established in 2017, 2018. So throughout this challenging time, the mission of ECC actually didn't change. Because we're remaining devoted to this one core mission of promoting inclusion for marginalized communities. But what did change was the approach that we use and the specific projects that we are doing in order to better serve vulnerable communities. During the early stages of COVID in the United States, we suspended many of the project proposals that we already devoted a lot of time on and shifted our attention to serving people during a pandemic. We fundraised personal protective equipment and donated them to frontline hospitals serving minority communities, especially underinsured or uninsured minority communities who are extra vulnerable during this time. We also cooperated with the Los Angeles mayor, Eric Garcetti, to communicate with the Martin Luther King Community Junior Community Hospital in Los Angeles to see what medical supplies they're needing, and we're trying to supply them with the medical supplies. And also, we also wanted to make sure that people have the awareness regarding the marginalized communities during this difficult time. For example, when COVID first came to America, there was a strong anti-Asian discrimination or a sense of anti-Asian sentiment in many areas of this country. And that is not only harmful to individuals, but it's harmful to the disease control efforts as a whole, because we don't want to incentivize people from not participating in the public health system just because they're afraid they're to be discriminated against. They have to feel safe to report themselves when they feel that they could be exposed, and they can help their community as well. So because of that, we organized a panel and a forum with Asia Society as a Rockefeller institution to organize to combat racism in a time of COVID. I served as one of the guest speakers along with Congressman Ted Lieu of California, the mayor of Los Angeles, and also Joseph String, the former executive director of the United Nations World Food Program. We try to break the echo chamber around this issue about how we can also pay attention to the marginalized communities during this difficult, actually especially during this difficult time as they're facing extra difficulties and challenges because of this pandemic. And I think at the end, when we consider marginalized voices and how to amplify their voices during this time, we have to be able to understand the critical nature of respecting what they're going through, what the struggles they're going through. And only by understanding their struggles and trying to raise the awareness of the struggles to more people, that we can truly help everyone equally during this difficult time.
Most definitely. I think it's such a multifaceted issue. Equity, and in terms of marginalized voices, the COVID-19 pandemic was definitely a stressor and pointed out a lot of underlying issues that we have in terms of equity, in terms of suppressing marginalized voices. And I think that's definitely one of the biggest concerns, is that during this time, marginalized voices are only going to be more suppressed. And so it's really great and actually really relieving how you're taking the direct initiative to make sure that we break this echo chamber and make sure that all voices are represented, especially during a public health crisis where it is a direct human issue that affects human lives. And so that directly turns into one of the next concerns in general, is in terms of improving cooperation and transparency while keeping in mind the considerations that Stefan brought up about equity and accessibility. And so this is a question that I would like to pose to all the panelists, and any of you can respond to this in any order. But in general, with machine learning, I think definitely bias and marginalization are two of the biggest criticisms that currently exist within machine learning development. And so despite the opportunities that machine learning technologies present, there will always be differences in their intended use and their actual use, leading to the consequences that Stefan mentioned before. So how can global institutions on a very large scale actually come together and solve for the gaps within AI and emerging COVID-19 technologies?
You know, if I can start, I think this kind of thing, you know, the fact that Integrity is a medical doctor and Stefan is a social activist and I'm a nerd, very much of a nerd. But the fact that actually we need to bring all parts of our society together to have these dialogues and to implement. I think when we silo, I think a lot of the technological choices are made without proper thought of what the ethical implications were. It's not that technological people are bad, it's just that it isn't necessarily part of our thinking. And by working with people like all of you, you know, together to understand what the, you know, the health implications are, Integrity, and what the social equity implications are, Stefan, I think that kind of dialogue doesn't, how to say this, it doesn't happen naturally, and we need to foster it with conversations like this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think John mentioned such a wonderful point about opening this dialogue with different sections of our society. And I think for international community as well, one of the most critical steps we need to take is resource coordination. For example, during the early stages of COVID here in the United States, the ECC tried to help Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York to get ventilators from China. That at that time, China has already been containing the outbreak, and they have a surplus of ventilators, whereas hospitals in New York State are desperately needing them because they are the last line of defense for people who are experiencing severe symptoms of COVID, and especially using invasive ventilators as one of the last resorts to help people, to save people's lives. And then by coordinating the resources, by transferring ventilators, to medical supplies from areas less affected by COVID at a certain time, and translate and to move these resources to areas that need the most, that can really save lives during this difficult time.
Mm-hmm. And I also think we need to have these discussions early on. We need to put like people from different fields, the technical people, the medical people, ethicists, from the inception of product development. I think sometimes we delay having these conversations, and that sort of collaboration is made when it's done when it's already too late, and when the product is already at an advanced stage of development. So I think we should have these sort of conversations from the inception.
Most definitely. I think on a macro global institutional scale, that is essential and also a priority that needs to be taking place, especially right now with resource coordination. But I also was thinking about someone like myself. I'm 18 years old, I'm quite young, and I'm not sure about what exactly my scale of impact could be. And so while there may be these overarching steps that the international community could take, I'm wondering for all of the panelists, what do you all think about younger individuals? What steps can my generation and future generations take to ensure that we have more inclusive responses to public health crises like COVID-19?
Wow.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, what a great thought. I always think of myself as a younger individual.
I mean, young in spirit and in age.
What were you going to say, Stefan?
Well, I was going to say, well, thank you for this great question. I think young people is very much the future of AI. Young scholars are going to definitely shape the field of artificial intelligence in the future. And I think one critical area that young people should consider as they're studying the technology is that technology can be used for different purposes. And only when it's used for positive purposes, for ethical purposes, can we truly unleash the potential of AI and to benefit our mankind, our society. So it is, I think, absolutely imperative for young people to consider the ethical consequence, the ethical ramifications of using artificial intelligence. For example, people can start by studying the major debates in the area of AI. There's surveillance and privacy, and also John earlier mentioned how we don't want to, when we're collecting data, doing contact tracing, we want people to understand that we're not infringing completely on their social condition, on their privacy, but we want them to understand this is a precaution to combat this public health crisis. All these involve critical thinking about the ramifications, about the social conditions of each situation, and what are the protection that we should have for people under all circumstances. And I think artificial intelligence as a very far-reaching technology, the scholars, the young people who are going to shape this area should definitely keep these ethical concerns in mind.
Most definitely. And I think too, like as a younger individual, it's really good how there are these set parameters that we should be following. I think oftentimes my generation or something that I was concerned about is that we don't necessarily have direction about how to make sure that AI is more inclusive because we're unsure about the steps that we should be taking. So looking at those ethical concerns, I think is definitely important. And I think I also want to look at this on a more technical side as well about, in general, individuals who are trying to go into the field of artificial intelligence or at least explore it. John, I actually wanted to turn this to you. What sort of, on the technical side of things, what sort of biases already exist within AI that the younger generation should be well aware of? And how can my generation in the future identify where these biggest inequities exist within AI?
I think, I think this is a really good question, Lila. But, I think the big point is I think most AI, not all AI, but most people who set out to build something don't do it with the intent to do harm. And I think that that's not, 100% of the case, unfortunately. But for most cases, I think the most powerful thing that young voices bring to this is, believe it or not, it's doubt, it's question, respectful and responsible questioning. So I don't mean to make this so much a generational thing, but in my kind of nerdy world, we were designed to create the right the solution based on the requirements. The problem is a lot of these things, like if you think about the technical implications of having a cell phone and how just sharing your facial features can actually compromise personal information. In most cases, somebody has a reasonably, at least in their mind, a reasonable intent. What we really have to do, I think the biggest enemy is certainty. If somebody is absolutely certain that the tool as designed would do no harm, you really need to ask somebody is, what is the unintended consequence of something? What is the potential harm that something could cause? Bias. You look at, for example, facial recognition, and a white middle-aged guy is probably 99% recognized by these facial things. But if you're a woman of color, it might be much lower. It doesn't represent any ill intent on anybody's part. It represents years and years of social bias, where that is the the public image recognition, image data sets that are collected out on the interwebs. We have to be respectfully questioning and always asking, how could this technology misuse? How can this technology take someone's private information and use it for an intent that she or he didn't want? And I think that as young people, you have a very powerful voice. As I see, I've been at this a long time, and I've been 4 decades in this industry, and I have never seen anything anywhere near as powerful as this AI mix. And I'm not exaggerating. It's just moving so fast. I think that the people who are most versed in it are coming out of universities now, and you all have a very powerful voice to ask the question, can this technology be used in a way that we didn't intend? Can we build in, safeguards to prevent the data from being misused? And can we even talk to our younger brothers, sisters, people who are in schools who are, growing up with these kind of phones, to make them make informed choices about how they share their information? I think information is really powerful. I think respectful and constructive questioning is really powerful. So I think your voice is the most powerful thing.
Most definitely. And I think the youth and the generation that I'm in, I guess one of the best features, I think, is our ability to think critically and also responsibly question what's going on around us. And so I'm hoping that's something I'll be able to see in the future with tech, because it's not the intention that's bad, it's just the unintended consequences, like you said. And since we're getting towards the end of our time, I wanted to leave you all with one final question. I wanted Integrity to start, especially with his work in public health and bridging the divide. And so the question is there a way for us to use or deploy technology to create a pathway towards equity and fairness? Or how can we guarantee that artificial intelligence tools are being harnessed as a solution to the problem of public health?
Mm-hmm. So definitely, I certainly agree with what John was saying, that I think human values and our human protections, they should be central to all the solutions that we're developing. If we make human values central, it definitely is going to help the AI or whatever technological solution that we might develop to harness its potential to actually solve the challenges that we're facing.
Most definitely. And I think with that, with all three insights, that's a very powerful combination. And I hope people of my generation take note of this in the future. And with that, that concludes our panel. So thank you all for watching.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yeah.